Okay, hello. So, if you're new to this channel, I use data to answer questions that are mostly stupid, sometimes serious, typically in the realm of like internet trends, entertainment, that jazz. And today we're looking at the way Rotten Tomatoes quantifies movie ratings and whether or not the year 2020, with all of its implications on the film industry, poked holes in that rating system. So I, like many others, have been fascinated by the downward trajectory of the Wonder Woman 1984 Rotten Tomatoes scores. For those of you who don't know, Wonder Woman 1984, the sequel to the Wonder Woman film from 2017, came out on Christmas of 2020, and it debuted with glowing reviews. It was certified fresh. And then over the course of the next few weeks, that score just kept steadily dropping and dropping and dropping to where it is now, which is on the cusp of rotten. Now, quick disclaimer, I know some of you might have seen Dan Murrell's videos on this topic, also dug through the data and analyzed the Wonder Woman ratings, and he also did a separate analysis on Rotten Tomatoes reviews in general. But if you've seen those videos, don't click off, because this video is very different from what Dan did. Number one, because in his video, he mostly looked at films before 2020, whereas my analysis almost exclusively focuses on films that released in 2020. And number two, I'm not trying to start beef here, but my analysis is fairly more comprehensive because I used code. So I was able to scrape this data from Rotten Tomatoes with just one click of a button, really. I could collect data for hundreds and hundreds of films and how their score changed over years of time. Whereas Dan, for his analysis, did most of that data collection manually, which is incredible work, and he did an incredible job. But just because of the nature of my methods, I was able to be a bit more comprehensive and, dare I say, robust. In my defense, I did leave a comment on one of Dan's videos saying that I was happy to share this code with him, and that's still true. So if for whatever reason, Dan, you're watching and you want to get a hands on this code yourself and be able to do this analysis at a quicker pace, I would love to share that with you, because honestly, I think your background in film reviews and Rotten Tomatoes is much more informed than mine, so I'd love to see your take on this. Now, before we move into the analysis, I want to quickly explain how the code works. So you all know what the Wayback Machine is, right? It archives websites and it shows you the version of that website on any given day. So what I did basically is that I fed my code the URL for the Wonder Woman Rotten Tomatoes page, and I accessed that archived version for each day since it first went up on the Rotten Tomatoes website until today. And then on each of those pages, I scraped the Rotten Tomatoes score and a couple of other metrics that we'll get to later. I want to quickly say that I have a personal vendetta against the Rotten Tomatoes website designers because they change their front-end code so often that even though I was only scraping movies for the past 3 years, I had to write 10 different versions of this scraper to be able to scrape all the different versions of your website. It was an absolute hellscape. I've never had to write so many different versions of scrapers to literally just scrape one stinking number. Rotten Tomatoes web developers, what is up? Like, is this a call for help? I don't know. It was super bizarre and annoying. But let's get to the analysis. So, like I said at the top, and as you can see in this graph, Wonder Woman 1984 dropped from certified fresh to rotten, right? This green area representing the range of scores that make sure that you're certified fresh, the yellow meaning that you're just regular old fresh, and red meaning rotten. Now, certified fresh is different from regular fresh. That it means that Rotten Tomatoes was confident enough based on early reviews to say that this is definitely fresh. There is no way in hell it will be going down towards the rotten side. Whoops. In order to qualify to be certified fresh, a movie or TV show must have a consistent Rotten Tomatoes score of 75% or higher. And it can't just be like 1 or 2 reviews, right? It has to be like, I think, at least 5 reviews from top-rated critics on the platform. So why was Wonder Woman 1984 initially certified fresh but is now sitting at 59%? Well, the film was receiving near total praise at the beginning when critics were first able to post their reviews on the website. When reviews started pouring in for Wonder Woman 1984, it debuted at an 89%. That's pretty dang high. And then it had a precipitous drop to now, where it's hovering between 60 and 59%, which is pretty crazy because 60% means that the film is fresh, 59% means that it's rotten. And I've seen it go back and forth a couple of times in the course of this analysis. Either way, it's a huge drop. It's a change in 30% from initial rating to now. And this score isn't like the audience reviews, right? Where the public can band together and either jack a score up or like bring it down. The score is based off of a pool of professional critics' reviews, whose literal jobs is to review these types of films. This news led to a lot of conspiracy theories. People were saying that the first critics to review this movies were paid off by Warner Brothers in some way to give the film glowing reviews, even though it was actually bad. And so now a lot of people are in this boat where they do not trust early reviews at all, because they have it in their mind that in order to get early access to a movie before it's premiered, you have to have won over the studio in some way and be in their good graces. Maybe by saying that their bad movies are actually good, which maybe there's some truth to that, but I thought that was extremely likely just because I'd never heard of this kind of drop in ratings ever happen for another movie. So I wanted to look at the data to see if this is a pattern that we've seen for other movies. And it turns out, yeah, Wonder Woman 1984 was not the only film to come out in 2020 that experienced this kind of drop in ratings. So Mulan, which came out in September, debuted initially at 82% and over the next weeks dropped to 73%, which is about a 9% drop in ratings. And then Tenet, which initially debuted at 88%, is now at 70%. That's an 18% drop in ratings. Now, I get it, neither of these films had as dramatic as a drop as Wonder Woman 1984 did, but both of them did drop an entire level in ratings. When they initially debuted, they both met the threshold to be certified fresh, and over the course of the next few weeks, they lost that rating and just became regular old fresh. Okay, so why wasn't there a big hullabaloo when these films lost their ratings? I don't want to present the narrative that all films experience this kind of drop in ratings, because a lot of films that came out in 2020 were consistently reviewed. If you look at the score for Scoob, or Artemis Fowl, or Birds of Prey, or The Lovebirds, all of which came out in 2020 also, the line is pretty much flat. It's worth noting that for all of these movies, still, early critics were more positive than the later batches of reviews that came out. But still, the drop was nowhere near that experienced by Mulan, Tenet, or Wonder Woman 1984. None of these films experienced a whole drop in rankings like the other three films I mentioned. But there are some differences between these four films and these three films, right? The most obvious of which is that Tenet, Mulan, and Wonder Woman 1984 were blockbusters, or at least the closest you can get to them in 2020. All of these films had a lot of buzz around them, and some people even went to the theaters to watch these films despite, pandemic. And with that type of hype, especially in a year that has been almost dead when it comes to new releases, there's bound to be a lot of public opinion. So I think I mentioned this earlier, Rotten Tomatoes differentiates between critic reviews and audience reviews. And another metric I scraped was not just the score, but the number of reviews for each film, right? So let's look at this graph for Scoob, for example. The number of critic reviews over time is represented by the blue curve, and the total number of audience reviews over time is represented by the orange curve. So 2 months after its release, the most reviews that Scoob got was around 1,600. And similarly, like The Lovebirds didn't even crack 1,000. It's sitting at 912 audience reviews right now. Compare that to Tenet, which within 2 months has more than 5,000 reviews, or Mulan, which within 2 months has more than 10,000 reviews. And Wonder Woman 1984, it hasn't quite hit that 2-month threshold. We're about a month out from its release. But still, it's sitting at more than 2,500 reviews, and certainly more are going to pour in. So all of this to just state the obvious, more people saw Mulan, Tenet, and Wonder Woman 1984. More people probably had stronger opinions about them, so more reviews. Let's look at these number of reviews graphs for Tenet and Wonder Woman 1984 more closely. Do you see how that orange audience curve starts at a much later point than that of the critics' review curve? So that's because a number of critics are able to do early reviews, right? They're able to see the movie before it's actually been released in theaters and post their reviews online. For Wonder Woman 1984, reviews from critics started pouring in on December 15th from a very select group of critics, which was well before its Christmas debut, almost 2 weeks, right? Whereas Tenet had about a week for early reviews to pour in. So Wonder Woman 1984 was special because it had what is called a staggered embargo. So that means that critics were given a date for when they could publish their reviews. So like some critics were in that early group where they were able to release their review on December 15th. Some had to wait a week after that to post their reviews. And you can see this in the graph. Let's look at that blue curve more closely. You can see it start to rise even before the theatrical release of the film, right? The blue curve is starting to gain volume even before the orange curve starts because more and more people were able to post their reviews. So yeah, this type of release schedule did mean that Warner Brothers had a greater amount of agency in terms of which critics were reviewing Wonder Woman 1984 at which point in the release schedule. So it's possible that this release schedule had the kind of effect that the conspiracy theorists are saying it did. That's not something we'd be able to prove with this data, but I did just want to point it out. And also, like, I will say that whole conspiracy theory makes me feel really uncomfortable because at the end of the day, these are professionals. They take their job seriously. I think it's really kind of disrespectful, honestly, to say that they were paid off, but that's just my take. But everyone loves to hate critics, largely because they think there's some sort of divide between how critics view movies and how audience views movies, which may be true. But I bring that up because we've only been looking at critic reviews up until this point, because the Rotten Tomatoes score only depends on critic reviews. So I want to shift gears a bit and talk about audience reviews for these films. Whereas the graphs for the critical reviews tell a somewhat similar story for each of these films, the same cannot at all be said about audience reviews. Critic scores are in blue here, and audience scores are in orange. So, for example, on Wonder Woman 1984, audiences were mostly middling. They didn't have a big change in opinion like critics did. But for Tenet, audiences followed pretty much the exact same downward trajectory as critics did, to a T. Look at how closely these graphs align. But even more than that, audiences were much more critical of Mulan than critics were. And listen, I guess it makes sense that you wouldn't be able to neatly box audience reviews into a kind of narrative as you can critics, because audiences are a much larger pool than the group of critics are on Rotten Tomatoes. And also, this audience group is not necessarily the same group reviewing each movie. So, of course, they're going to behave differently if, like, the people who viewed Wonder Woman 1984 are not the same people who reviewed Tenet, for example. But even accounting for that, I think it's possible that in all of these scenarios, critics were influenced by the public opinion of each of these films. I actually think that's very likely. So if you look at Mulan, for example, perhaps the score was going down so quickly because the greater public had such a negative reaction to it. Or Tenet, it's a chicken or the egg scenario. Were the critic scores going down because of audiences, or were audience scores going down because of the critic score? And then Wonder Woman 1984, even though audiences were sort of middling on it, their initial perception of it was much lower than what critics were. So perhaps critics' scores were going down because of that mismatch between critics and audience ratings. To be clear, I'm not saying that like the critics who are reviewing the film at a later point were like doing the mental calculations in their head and like, oh, the public thinks this, so I have to go with the public now. Like, no, that's not at all what I'm saying. But I think all of us are somewhat influenced by what we read on Twitter or what we read in the news or what our friends are saying. So yeah, if you hear a ton of people that you respect and trust saying they don't like this film, maybe that would influence how you rate the film, or at least the lens through which you view it. I don't know. I think that's extremely likely, especially when you consider the fact that viewing experiences in 2020 are very isolated now, right? Before, we were able to go to theaters, we were able to gauge the reaction of a crowd, and all of that, whether you admit it or not, does inform your perception of a film. So critics have lost that ability to be able to gauge how other people are reacting to the film, and they only have their own judgment because we're all just watching these movies in our living rooms for the most part. So now seems like a good idea to explain Rotten Tomatoes' scoring system. When I say that a film has a Rotten Tomatoes score of 89%, that doesn't mean that it's like a B+, that's somehow a metric of its quality. What that means is that 89% of critics enjoyed the film. And enjoy means a lot of things, right? It could mean like something like The Godfather, where like this is a genius film, or it could be something like Happy Feet. That's like a nice film with a good message you enjoy while you're watching it, but it's not necessarily one that sticks with you after viewing. It's a binary system. So basically, did you enjoy this movie? Yes, no. I want to take this time to look at the graph for Soul, another one of 2020's pseudo-blockbuster films. I didn't mention this film earlier because although it got a high volume of reviews, the graph is fairly boring because it's just a good film. Most critics who viewed it agreed, and it's been in that 90 to 100 range ever since debuting. This is truly a film that is certified fresh. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a critic watching a movie like Wonder Woman 1984, which has many marks of being a bad film, right? Like the plot doesn't quite make sense. The characters have this like kind of cheesy, almost brute force characterization. Just a lot of the scenes are like clearly put in there for the aesthetic of it rather than like the sense of it. But you still walk away having enjoyed the movie. Now, what do you do in that situation? Do you say it's rotten because in many ways it resembles a bad film? Or do you say that it's fresh because you walked away having enjoyed it? It's difficult to grade on the scale that Rotten Tomatoes presents you, right? And I would imagine that critics have different approaches to that. Some would probably say it's fresh, and some would probably say it's rotten. So that fact, that it's not exactly clear how to grade Wonder Woman 1984, coupled with the fact that it was given a staggered embargo, and the inability of critics to sanity check their reactions to the film against other people who had viewed it, might have led to the sort of critical whiplash we're seeing with the Wonder Woman 1984 ratings. Let's bring up the Birds of Prey graph again, and let's layer that audience graph over it in orange. Wow, those curves are remarkably similar in shape, right? Now, Birds of Prey was one of the last movies that we, as the public, got to see in theaters, before the whole pandemic blew out of proportions. That's a fact that's also reflected in the number of reviews graph for the film. So, right, 16,000 reviews is more than any of these films received, even Wonder Woman 1984 and Tenet. So maybe that fact that we were able to actually see this in theaters and more people were to see it is why these curves so closely mimic each other. It's more than likely just a coincidence, but I don't know. I already had this sort of hypothesis in my head, and then I saw this graph and I was like, whoa, that's kind of crazy. But I'm smart enough to realize that this is most likely confirmation bias. I'm not smart enough to not put it in the video though. So there you go. On that note, what about before 2020? After looking at a bunch of films, it's pretty rare, honestly, to see the kind of drop in reviews that we saw for Wonder Woman 1984 or Tenet or Mulan. And that's true even for controversial films. I think the most comparable films to Mulan were the 2019 releases of Aladdin and Lion King, both of which were live-action reimaginings of the classic Disney animated film. So both Lion King and Aladdin were pretty consistently reviewed by critics. They mostly spent their time in the red region. And what's interesting is that audiences were more favorable on these films compared to critics, which is the opposite phenomenon that we saw in Mulan, right? I thought that was interesting, and it might speak to the fact that in 2020 there were much fewer releases and options, essentially, for movie lovers to see. So I wonder if in 2020, the reason that people were panning Mulan is that we didn't have much else, and the people reviewing this film were not watching it because they necessarily wanted to see it, like would have been the case for Lion King and Aladdin, but a lot of people were watching this purely because they were starved for new content. I think that might be the case. I watched Mulan when it had come out, and I had never seen any of the Disney remakes in theaters. And while I'm not the type to go on Rotten Tomatoes and vent my thoughts or frustrations, I certainly see a lot of people doing that who might not have otherwise for Aladdin or The Lion King. I also took a look at reviews for Godzilla, King of the Monsters, a very guilty pleasure of mine. But this speaks to what I was saying earlier, which is like this film has a lot of hallmarks of a bad film. Like the dialogue, the visuals in a lot of cases are pretty bad, but it's still enjoyable because it's one of those like spectacle blockbuster films. And you can see those divergent paths of thinking in terms of how high the audience rated this film and how low the critics rated this film. This is nothing new. We know this to be the case. I just thought I would put this graph in there to illustrate that point about the Rotten Tomatoes binary system further. Now, you can't talk about Rotten Tomatoes without bringing up Captain Marvel. So in 2019, I think, Brie Larson and I believe a couple of other people involved with the film's productions made a few statements about the state of women's representation in the media and in the industry. And this led a lot of enthusiastic people to believe that the film would be nothing more than feminazi propaganda, despite the fact that all of this had happened prior to the film's release date, and of course none of these people had seen the film yet. So all of these people, without having seen the film, poorly rated it, and this is a practice known as review bombing. We've seen it happen time and time again for films that have like the thinnest veneer of progressivism, or for video games a lot of the time. And I think eventually I will do an analysis of review bombing because it's kind of fascinating. But the situation surrounding Captain Marvel was like the review bombing to end all review bombing. Literally. Because this caused Rotten Tomatoes to change the way that people could score a film. Now, audiences can no longer give a film a review before it had released in theaters, which makes sense. Huge chunks of the population are not going to be able to watch the movie prior to the theater release date, so good on ya, Rotten Tomatoes. Still, amid all of that instability, critics remained very steadfast in their opinions of the film. Look at this graph. The blue line is remarkably flat. So I could actually be convinced by the argument that you're less likely to see a drop in ratings by critics for films that are controversial, at least if audiences are the source of that controversy, right? Let's look at the graph for The Last Jedi, which was very similar to Captain Marvel, and not in that people were rating the film poorly due to like feminist statements or prior to the release date, but due to the fact that audiences were reviewing the film poorly based off of their attachments to the original franchise, and they didn't like a lot of the story beats in the movie. It wasn't necessarily because the movie was poorly told, although certainly a lot of people felt that way. But you get what I'm saying here. I don't need to explain this in depth. Regardless, I bring this up because Wonder Woman 1984 is also caught in its own controversy right now. But unlike Captain Marvel and The Last Jedi, this controversy isn't because fans are whining about perceived feminism or like quote-unquote disrespect to the original franchise, but rather it's because of a pretty jarring decision that was made in the film that seems to go at odds with its very core message of gender equality. And, you know, when I was doing the research for this video, I stumbled upon another film that had lost its certified fresh rating. The film, like Wonder Woman 1984, had a staggered embargo. It was caught in a similar controversy of mixed messages that was actually divisive and actually promoted nuanced discussion, as opposed to a bunch of scorned fans review bombing the film. And believe it or not, the movie in question was also a DC movie.
Send in the clowns.
Yeah, I'm talking about Joker. So Joker was clearly not rotten and did not approach being rotten in its entire run. But I thought it was very interesting that the circumstances of Joker's release so closely mirrored that of Wonder Woman 1984's release, minus the whole pandemic thing. So yeah, that's my hypothesis. Wonder Woman 1984's rating dropped so suddenly because there was the perfect storm of a staggered embargo, of controversy, of a lack of other movies for the broader public to watch, and of the extremely isolating movie-going experience in 2020. I hope to have showed you that this kind of drop in Rotten Tomatoes ratings isn't entirely unprecedented, but the effect might have been more pronounced due to the extenuating circumstances of 2020. But yeah, that's it for this video. Even though it was a pain in the ass to write those 10 different versions of the scraping code for this project, the good thing about it is that I can now use the code for future projects. So I now have a greater ability to do more projects analyzing popular franchises and movies and TV shows. So I know a lot of you enjoyed my Star Wars video from a couple of weeks back. What other franchises would you want me to look into? I do already have a video idea planned to look into a very popular TV show that I very much enjoy. And if you want a hint for what TV show that is, stay tuned till the end. But I'm always open to ideas and would love to know what sorts of things you'd like me to look into. I also realized I should promote my Medium more, so for a lot of my videos, I will post accompanying tutorials on Medium, whether that's going through the code of the data analysis itself or how I scrape the data for the analysis. So that link will be in the description. If you're curious and want to see the data for some other movies that I didn't mention in this video, definitely check out that article. Oh, as always, you can follow me on Twitter at vastava_ to stay up to date with me and my projects. If you're watching the video to the end, please consider liking it. It really does help a lot. Commenting even more so. And definitely subscribe if you want to see more content like this in the future. And yeah, with that, I will catch you all in the next one. Bye!